Hey everybody, what is up? I know you're stressing about that test, but don't even trip, just lay back and drink this video. And smash that like button and subscribe while the music plays. Hey, before we start, click the link in the description to get notes to follow along with everything in this video. Alright, so economics is the study of choice, and the reason we have to make choices is because of scarcity. Scarcity is the fundamental problem of economics. Resources are scarce whenever there's a greater quantity desired than available. And because we often want more than is available, we have to make choices. But this means we can't have everything we want, so we face trade-offs. Whenever we choose to do one thing, there's something else that we can't do now. If I go on a ski trip this weekend, that means I can't go snorkeling in the Florida Keys on that same weekend. Gotta make choices. Opportunity cost is one of the most important concepts in this whole class. The true cost of something is what you give up to get it. The cost of that ski trip isn't the money we spent, it's whatever else we would have done with that time and money. And it's not anything you could have done, it's what you would have done if you didn't go on that trip. So for me, the opportunity cost of going skiing could just be a weekend snorkeling in the Keys. For somebody else, it might be something different. And this just goes to support an old saying in economics that there's no such thing as a free lunch, which means that there's a cost to literally every single choice we make in life. Okay, so if economics is about getting the most we can from our scarce resources, then let's quickly highlight our resources, aka factors of production. In other words, the things we use to produce other stuff. Land includes all natural resources. Labor is the effort and skill of workers. Next is capital, which we have two types of, physical and human. Physical capital is man-made goods that are used to make other goods and services, things like tools, machines, technology, and buildings. Human capital refers to the knowledge, education, skills, and experience of workers. Entrepreneurship involves the innovations and risk to bring new or improved technologies to market. And lastly, established knowledge refers to the accumulated knowledge of humankind that we're able to use to create new things. Thankfully, we don't need to rediscover gravity or pasteurization or electricity every single generation. Okay, and that takes us very nicely to our first model of economics, the Production Possibilities Curve, or the PPC. Like the name suggests, the PPC shows what it's possible for an economy to produce. And good news, we're going to make a simplifying assumption that we can only make two goods. In this case, we'll say capital goods and consumer goods. We'll put capital goods on our vertical or y-axis and consumer goods on the horizontal or x-axis. And our PPC is downward sloping, going from one axis to the other. The curve represents the outer limit of what's currently possible for this economy or person to produce. Notice they can produce at maximum 100 capital goods or 200 consumer goods, but nothing more. The PPC highlights scarcity because it's not possible to produce an infinite amount of capital and consumer goods. So choices have to be made. If they maximize capital production, they can make 100 capital goods and 0 consumer goods. Or they can use all their resources producing consumer goods, but then they'll be making 0 capital goods. Or they can produce some combination in between, like 50 capital and 100 consumer goods. And that's trade-offs, right? If they're operating on the PPC and want to produce more consumer goods, the only way to do so is to produce fewer capital goods. We can also see opportunity cost by noticing what happens when we move from point A to point B. We gain 100 consumer goods, right? We had 50 and now we have 150. Okay, but what's the opportunity cost? What do we give up? We were making 75 capital goods at A and now we're making only 25 at B. So the opportunity cost of moving from A to B is 50 capital goods. Any point on the PPC is a point of efficiency, meaning that it's not possible to make more of one good without making less of the other. And anywhere inside the PPC, the economy has underutilized resources, and this is inefficient. At point C, it's possible to make more of both capital and consumer goods, so there are resources available that aren't being used. Any point outside the PPC isn't currently a combination of goods that can be produced, but it can become possible in the future as a result of economic growth. Economic growth occurs because of an increase in the factors of production. So if land, labor, or capital increases, our economy will be able to produce more. Now, it is possible for the PPC to shift inward as a result of a decrease in our factors of production, perhaps caused by a war or natural disaster, and this is known as a contraction. Most economic contractions, though, don't cause the PPC to shift inward, but rather are simply the result of underutilizing resources we have but aren't using, like we just discussed a moment ago. And the last thing in this section is that our PPC isn't always linear. We have 3 different shapes, and they reflect differences in opportunity costs. The linear PPC we've been using represents constant opportunity costs. Our opportunity costs remain 25 capital goods the whole way down the PPC. The PPC can also represent increasing opportunity costs, and it does so on a concave or bowed outward PPC. From A to B, the opportunity cost is 10 capital goods. From B to C, it's 15 capital goods, and from C to D, it's even more, 50 capital goods. Now, this is actually a more realistic version of the PPC because the resources that are really useful in making one good might not be very useful for making the other good. And lastly, decreasing opportunity costs are shown by a convex or bowed inward PPC. It's the opposite of the last one. The more consumer goods we produce, the fewer capital goods we have to give up, and vice versa. Basically, the idea is that by producing more of one, it actually makes us better producing the other. Okay, next up, comparative advantage and gains from trade. The big picture takeaway from this section is that trade is good. People benefit from trade. Of course, we're going to put some vocabulary to it and make you do calculations, but that's the thesis of this section. At the heart of this section is specialization. Specialization is when each of us focus on doing something we're good at instead of trying to do everything for ourselves. I specialize teaching economics and then pay the grocery store for my food. But how do we decide who should specialize in what? Well, we have 2 types of advantages a person or country can have: absolute and comparative advantage. Absolute advantage means that a person can produce more of a good or service than anybody else with the same resources. They're the best at producing that thing. They can make more, they can do it faster. Comparative advantage, on the other hand, means that a person can produce something at a lower opportunity cost than the other person. In other words, they give up less than the other person does to make that same thing. That probably sounds a little vague, so let's jump into an example to see what this looks like. We'll always assume, by the way, that there are only 2 countries and they each have 2 options of what they can produce. Okay, so here we have Gondor and Rohan, and they can make swords and saddles. This is an output question because it's showing us how much each of them can produce. Gondor can make 100 swords or 400 saddles, or some combination of both. Rohan can make 25 swords or 200 saddles, or some combination. Let's start with absolute advantage. Gondor has the absolute advantage making swords because 100 is greater than 25. It's honestly that simple. How great is that? Gondor also has the absolute advantage making saddles because 400 is greater than 200. But here's the thing. We don't trade based on absolute advantage. In this example, Gondor has the absolute advantage in both swords and saddles. But both countries can still benefit from specialization in trade, even though Gondor has an absolute advantage in both goods. We decide who should make each good based on comparative advantage. Comparative advantage means producing something at a lower opportunity cost than the other person or country. And opportunity cost refers to what we gave up. So we'll calculate the opportunity cost of each country of producing swords and saddles. What is Gondor's opportunity cost of producing one sword? In other words, each time they make one sword, how many saddles do they give up the opportunity to make? Because this is an output question, when you're setting up your ratio, I want you to remember the acronym OOO, or OO. In output questions, the other good goes over. Since we're solving for the opportunity cost of one sword, it'll be saddles over swords, or 400 over 100. Simplify, and we arrive at 4 saddles. That means that for every one sword Gondor makes, it's giving up the opportunity to produce 4 saddles. Now do the same thing for Rohan. Saddles over swords, so 200 over 25. Simplify, and we get 8 saddles. For every one sword Rohan makes, it's giving up the opportunity to produce 8 saddles. What we do now is compare the opportunity costs. So who has the lower opportunity costs for making swords? Well, Gondor, because 4 saddles is less than 8 saddles. So Gondor has the comparative advantage making swords. That's not too bad, is it? I'm going to do the same thing again for saddles now. Pause the video real quick if you want to try to solve this first for yourself. Alright, to find Gondor's opportunity cost for one saddle, since this is an output question, the other goes over. That means swords over saddles, or 100 over 400, which simplifies to 1/4 of a sword. For Rohan, it's 25 over 200, which equals 1/8 of a sword. So this time Rohan has the comparative advantage because it has the lower opportunity cost. 1/8 of a sword is less than 1/4 of a sword. And notice that each country has a comparative advantage in one good. It'll basically always be that way. A country can't have a comparative advantage in both goods. The reason is because, well, did you notice that the opportunity costs are reciprocals of each other? 1/4 of a sword and 4 saddles? It'll always be like that. If it's not, check your math. Next is how we use this information. Each country specializes in whatever it has a comparative advantage in. Gondor will make only swords and Rohan will make only saddles, and then they'll engage in trade, trading some swords for some saddles. To create terms of trade that will be mutually beneficial, the basic principle is to make sure that each side is giving up less in this trade than they'd have to give up if they decided to make both goods themselves. Or we can say it the other way, which is to make sure that each side gains more from giving up one of the good that they're specializing in than they'd gain if they were making both goods themselves. That's a lot of words. The numbers will help. Rohan is making saddles. Without trade, if they wanted 1 sword, they'd give up the opportunity to make 8 saddles. So Rohan will benefit from trade if they are giving up less than 8 saddles per sword. Gondor is making swords. Without trade, if they chose to make 1 fewer sword, they'd be able to make 4 saddles. So for Gondor to benefit from trade, they need to receive more than 4 saddles per sword. So we realize that for the trade to be mutually beneficial, the terms of trade need to be 1 sword for between 5 and 7 saddles. And hopefully you notice that this is between both kingdoms' opportunity costs. It'll always be that way. And don't forget that sometimes you'll be given an input version of the question. Typically, this means they'll tell you how long it takes to produce something. In this case, the absolute advantage belongs to whoever can produce the good using fewer resources, so the smaller number this time. For comparative advantage, we set up the ratio differently, but don't worry, I have an acronym for you, IOU. For input questions, the other good goes under when we set up our ratio. Pause the video if you want to solve this out. Once you've calculated the opportunity costs, everything is the same as before. Alright, so now we're going to shift gears pretty dramatically and go into supply and demand, markets, and prices. Basically the foundation for the rest of the course. All that good stuff. We're going to start with demand. Demand is the willingness and ability to buy a good or service. Both parts have to be true. You have to want it and actually be able to buy it. The law of demand tells us that price and quantity demanded are inversely related. As the price rises, quantity demanded falls. And as the price falls, quantity demanded rises. This is basically the economist's way of stating the obvious: consumers like low prices. Okay, so far so good. So there's 2 ways that we can display that basic insight: a demand schedule and a demand curve, and let's go ahead and put them on the screen together. On our model, we label the y-axis price and the x-axis quantity. The demand schedule is a table that shows the quantity demanded at different prices, and as the price rises, the quantity demanded decreases. 99% of the time, you'll draw the model using variables like this. So what would cause us to move from point A to point B? A decrease in the price of the good, and this is known as a change in quantity demanded. Our demand hasn't actually changed. The demand curve shows our current preferences for the good at all possible prices. So our demand didn't change, only our quantity demanded changed. On our demand curve, we show a change in quantity demanded by a movement along the demand curve. An upward movement is caused by a higher price and decreases our quantity demanded, while a downward movement indicates a lower price and an increase in our quantity demanded. Again, the only thing that causes a change in quantity demanded is a change in the price of that good. Now we need to talk about what changes our demand. It has to be something besides a change in the price. There are basically 5 reasons that our demand will change, and we'll use the acronym TRIBE to help remember it. Change in tastes, preferences, change in the price of related goods, a change in income, a change in the number of buyers, and a change in the expected future prices. Let's turn to our graph. When there's a change in demand, it will shift our entire demand curve. When demand increases, the curve shifts right. Notice what this tells us. When demand increases, this shows that at any given price, there's a greater quantity demanded. Look at A and B. The price didn't change, but we're demanding more. Again, this illustrates that this shift must have been caused by something other than a change in the price. And when our demand decreases, the curve shifts left, showing we demand less at any given price. Okay, so let's talk about the 5 reasons our demand curve will shift. First up, taste and preferences. When something becomes more popular, the demand curve shifts right, and when something goes out of style, the demand curve shifts left. A change in the price of related goods also causes a change in demand. There are 2 types of related goods, substitutes and complements. A substitute is a good that buyers see as similar to another good. For example, peaches and nectarines. When the price of peaches increases, our demand for nectarines will increase. Now, nothing happened to the price of nectarines, but we're demanding more of them because the price of peaches increased. So when the price of a substitute rises, demand for the good increases. Complements are goods that consumers use together. For example, if the price of hot dogs rises, the demand for hot dog buns will fall, because if we aren't buying as many hot dogs, we don't need as many hot dog buns. So when the price of a complement rises, demand for the good decreases. Next is changes in income. If it's a normal good, the more income we have, the greater demand will be. Some goods are known as inferior goods though, so this doesn't always hold. As a person's income rises, their demand falls for inferior goods, but their demand increases when their income falls. Think of things like generic brands at the grocery store. If you lose your job, you still have to eat, right? But maybe you pick cheaper food, and that's the idea here. When the number of buyers increases, the demand increases, and if the number of buyers decreases, demand decreases. Makes sense. You have more or fewer people in the market. And lastly, the change in expectations. Now, be careful on this one. If consumers expect future prices to fall, then today's demand will decrease because we'll wait for the price to fall. But if we expect prices to rise, today's demand increases so we can buy it before the price goes up. Okay, so next up, supply. It's a very similar story, just kind of in reverse. Just don't forget to put yourself in the mindset of a seller. Supply refers to the willingness and ability to sell a good or service. The law of supply tells us that as the price increases, so does quantity supplied. There's a positive relationship between price and quantity supplied. And that should make sense. If you're selling something, would you want to sell it for a low or a high price? I thought so. We can see this on a supply schedule and a supply curve. The supply curve is upward sloping, showing that positive relationship. And we can see on the supply schedule that as the price rises, so does the quantity supplied. If the price increases, this will cause an upward movement along the supply curve, and this is known as an increase in quantity supplied. Just like with demand, a price change only causes a change in quantity supplied. It does not change supply itself. For supply to change, something other than the price of the good must change. So when supply does change, it will shift the entire supply curve right or left. When supply increases, the curve shifts right, increasing the supply at all prices, and when the supply decreases, the curve shifts left, decreasing the supply at all prices. I always wanted you to think of this as right and left, not as up and down. It'll mess you up real fast if you think of them as up and down. Okay, so first up, changes in technology. If technology improves, supply increases because they can make more of the good. And that means if something happens that destroys a bunch of technology, well, supply decreases. Next up are inputs. Inputs include things like the resources needed to make the good and the wages to pay workers for their labor. When input costs increase, supply decreases because it's more expensive to produce the good, and when input costs decrease, supply increases. Changes in government policies also affect supply. More specifically, if the government places a tax on the good, the supply decreases because it's more expensive to make it now. On the other hand, a subsidy, which is where the government provides money to encourage the production of something, will increase the supply since sellers love those sugary sweet subsidy dollars. Sellers also respond to expectations about future prices. If they expect higher prices in the future, today's supply will decrease because they'd rather wait to sell it for a higher price later. If they expect the price to fall, today's supply increases so they can sell it before the price decreases. And next is changes in the price of related goods. This is the most complicated one. Substitutes are two goods that can be made using the same inputs. For example, if I have potatoes, I can make either baked or mashed potatoes. If the price increases for baked potatoes, I'll supply fewer mashed potatoes because I can make more money selling baked potatoes. So if the price of a substitute rises, the supply of the other good decreases. Complements in production represent two goods for which an increase in the production of one causes an increase in the supply of the other. If the price of leather increases, this increases the supply of beef, even though nothing happened in the beef market. It was the result of an increase in the quantity supplied of leather because of the leather price increase. And saving the easiest for last, the number of sellers, supply increases when more sellers enter into the market, and it decreases when sellers exit. Okay, hang in there, people, you've almost made it. Last up is that we finally bring supply and demand together, and we'll actually have a market and prices to talk about. So how do we get a price? Easy. Find where the two curves intersect, and that point is known as market equilibrium. Quantity supplied equals quantity demanded. When you're drawing the model, make sure to draw your dashed lines out to each axis and label this as your initial price and quantity like this. Okay, so this is our market in equilibrium. But what if the price was higher, like here at P2? At this price, the quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded, and this creates a surplus. Basically, sellers are willing to sell lots of the good at the higher price, but buyers are like, nah, we good. So they'll only be able to sell QD units. The market is in disequilibrium. But don't worry, this signals that the price is too high, and this drives the price down towards equilibrium where the surplus is eliminated and quantity supplied equals quantity demanded once again. If the price is too low, it's the same story in reverse. Quantity demanded is greater than quantity supplied, and this creates a shortage where sellers run out very quickly of whatever they're willing to sell at this price. Again, this state of disequilibrium provides signals that the price is too low and needs to increase. Eventually, as the price increases, it eliminates the shortage and the market will again be back in equilibrium. The next major thing we need to do is to graph changes in supply and demand. So here's our market in equilibrium. This is basically always our starting point when you're drawing it, so make sure to practice it a lot so that you feel super comfortable doing so. Let's start with an increase in demand. Demand shifts to the right, and notice the result. We have our new equilibrium, and when we draw our dashed lines out, we can clearly see that the equilibrium price has increased, as has the equilibrium quantity. I like to draw small arrows on the axis, indicating that for myself and for the score. And notice I also named my new demand curve D2 and renamed the old one D1. I also drew an arrow pointing right to show the shift. Take your time and make sure you label everything on the graph. Nothing is worse than knowing the answer and doing everything right except labeling it and then losing points because of that. Okay, I'm going to go through the other three a little bit quicker. If demand decreases, same story in reverse. Demand shifts left, and this leads to a lower price and lower quantity. The nice thing about demand is that whatever happens to demand, the same thing happens to both price and quantity. But that's not going to be true of supply. If supply increases, it shifts to the right. This leads to a lower price and an increase in quantity. So notice that P and Q move in opposite directions of each other. If supply decreases, it shifts to the left, and this increases the price and decreases the quantity. Okay, so I know I went through the shifts fast, but that's a section you definitely want to practice. Draw the models, draw the shifts, just practice drawing. Last up is, what about if both supply and demand shift together? Now don't worry, you don't have to draw this. The way to figure this out isn't to draw it, but rather to take what we know happens when each curve shifts individually. Here are the results from each shift that we established before, and now we just compare them. If demand increases, the price rises. If supply increases, the price falls. That means we don't know what will happen to price if both of these things happen at the same time. But let's look at quantity. Demand increases and so does quantity. And when supply increases, again, so does quantity. This tells us that if both supply and demand increase, we know that quantity will increase, while we're unsure what will happen to price. And this table has each possible combination. Okay, well, great job sticking around to the end. You're gonna kill it on your test any minute now. Until next time, this has been a LaMoney production. Thanks again for watching this video. I really hope it helped. If it did, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. Check out the description for links to some great resources like a pretty incredible review book I wrote called AP Macro in 250 Words that I know will help you out so much. Check it out, and I'll see you in Unit 2.